Hello everybody and welcome to the TF1 show. So today I thought I'm in my best red for today's topic, and given that we are recording this the week before the German Grand Prix, or apologies, the Eiffel Grand Prix, I wanted to discuss one of the topics that's been weighing heavily on my heart and that's been causing me a bit of grief and anxiety recently, and I guess I'll explain over the course of this episode why it's been causing me quite a lot of stress. And ladies and gentlemen, that is the Ferrari Drivers Academy, which I argue might be the biggest and hottest mess to come out of Italy since Mount Vesuvius. Now, before we get into why I think this, I just want to ask you again, as you do, every week or every episode, if you enjoy my channel, please go and hit the subscribe button or leave me a little like. Or even if you're feeling really, giving, please leave a comment and tell me what you think about this video specifically, or just about my channel in general. I promise you I can deal with criticism. So if you don't agree with anything, please let me know down in the comments. Happy to chat to you. But let's get into the topic of today's video, or today's podcast rather, and that is the Ferrari Drivers Academy. Now, the reason it's been causing me so much anxiety is just because they have this pool of incredibly talented drivers, but I don't really know what they're going to do with all of them, because they have so many quality drivers that I'm going to go through just now. And from what I can see, obviously the end goal for an academy like the FDA is obviously to get these drivers into Formula One, and I guess eventually to have the best of the best in the Ferrari team. But Ferrari only has 2 spots, so I don't really know where all of them are going to go. And let's maybe talk about the situation that they currently have in Formula 2, because would you believe it, the FDA has 5 drivers driving in the F2 series this year, in Mick Schumacher, Callum Ilott, Robert Schwartzman, Marcus Armstrong, and Giuliano Alesi. Now, it's quite a relevant thing to talk about at the moment because, and I was so excited when I heard the news, and I'm really excited and looking forward to seeing them go, because Mick Schumacher and Callum Ilott are both driving in FP1 at the Eiffel Grand Prix. Now, Mick is driving for Alfa Romeo and Callum is going to be driving for Haas. Now, that in itself is quite an interesting predicament, because it obviously means that even though it's not a done deal, it at least means that these F1 teams are looking to invest or potentially sign these 2 drivers for one of their available seats next year. And I guess for Mick Schumacher and Callum Ilott, the F1 dream is probably the closest if you compare all of the other drivers in the FDA lineup. With Mick Schumacher, probably I'd say he has the best chance. He has the name, he has the story. It's all about getting Schumacher back into F1, and maybe one day getting him back in Ferrari. Probably gonna partner Charles Leclerc at some point. But getting Schumacher into the Alfa Romeo, which is essentially the Ferrari junior team, is probably going to be the logical next step. Callum Ilott has proven himself to be a really competent and fast driver, and he's always been one of the fastest drivers, through all of the junior categories. So him getting a shot, being second in the F2 Championship at the moment, him getting a shot at an FP1 is also really encouraging to see. And from that perspective, I do feel that the FDA is doing its job in getting its drivers the opportunities that you would have expected for a driver academy of its caliber and its budget and so on and so forth. But now it gets tricky, because Mick Schumacher and Callum Ilott, let's assume they get a seat in F1 next year. What are we going to do with Robert Schwartzman, Marcus Armstrong, and Giuliano Alesi? Now, Schwartzman, he's testing with Alfa Romeo at the end of the year in Abu Dhabi, which to me sort of indicates that he's probably not going to be first in line for a seat next year, and that they'll probably want to groom him to put on a big challenge for the F2 Championship next year, and then potentially get a seat in F1 the year thereafter. But then they have another junior in Marcus Armstrong that finished runner-up to Robert Schwartzman in the F3 Championship, who could potentially, I'll admit he did struggle a bit this year, especially in the middle part of the season, But who's not to say he gets his act together? He's an incredibly quick driver. And if he and Schwartzman all of a sudden challenge for the championship next year, who's going to get the F1 seat then? Are there going to be 2 seats available? Are we going to have to chuck both of them and banish them to go and do Formula E, WEC? I don't know what you do, IndyCar. It just sounds like a really, really difficult task for both Schwartzman and Armstrong to eventually get into F1, which is, I would have assumed, the goal that the FDA has. And lastly, we have Giuliano Alesi. Now, I'm going to be honest. I think Giuliano Alesi is there for team spirit. He's there for a good time. His father did sell his Ferrari F40, a priceless historical supercar to him for him to stay in F2. I don't think Giuliano is going to end up in F1, and I also don't think the FDA think Giuliano is going to end up in F1. But you know what? Giuliano Alesi is there and he's living his best life. Now let's quickly talk about the remaining drivers, because we've already established that we have a bunch of F2 drivers that could potentially move up into F1. In an ideal world, we'll probably see 4 out of the 5 have an F1 seat eventually. Whether that's going to be possible, highly doubtful. And then over and above that, we have a couple of drivers in Formula 3 and Formula Regional and in Formula 4 in Enzo Fittipaldi, Arthur Leclerc, Gianluca Petkov, and Dino Beganovic. Now, Enzo Fittipaldi is probably the next in line to graduate up into Formula 2, given that he just completed his first season in Formula 3, and there were a couple of positive signs from Enzo. I would expect him to stay in Formula 3 next year, just maybe potentially get a nice little seat at Prema and challenge for the title the year thereafter. But it's still the expectation from the FDA for Enzo to move up into Formula 2 eventually, and I guess later on into F1. The two that to me are more interesting at this point in time is Arthur Leclerc and Gianluca Petkov, with Leclerc probably being the most fascinating one, because obviously he is the younger brother of Charles, the current star and golden boy of Ferrari. Now, what a story that would be to have Arthur graduate into F1 alongside his brother. And I would imagine, and given how well he's been performing in Formula Regional, there's going to be a lot of momentum behind little Arthur Leclerc to eventually also move up into the categories, which then again poses the question, where is Arthur going to go? Ferrari only has 2 seats available. And if you have Charles and Mick Schumacher, let's say for argument's sake, there for the long term, what is Arthur going to do? Is Arthur just going to chill at Alfa Romeo for the rest of his time, for the rest of his years there? I don't know. Will Arthur even graduate to Formula 1? I guess that's the first question we need to ask. But it's an interesting question, an interesting dilemma that Ferrari has. Now, they also have a really, really positive and exciting driver in Gianluca Petkov, who's competing alongside Arthur at Prema in Formula Regional. Now, recently it seems like Petkov has ran into a bit of a financial difficulty where he's sort of struggling to get the funds together to maintain his drive in Formula Regional. Recently, luckily, he did announce that he found sponsors to continue at least to the end of the season. But I found it quite distressing that he wasn't pulled up by Prema to at least test for Formula 3 during the recent test that they did in Barcelona. So it might be difficult times for Petkov ahead if he doesn't get, I guess, the support from the FDA and from the sponsors that he requires to actually move up into the future categories. And lastly, I guess we can just touch on Dino Beganovic. Now, he's a little Swede, a very young driver still that's still driving in Formula 4. So I guess for him at least, the FDA is very much a long-term project, and depending on his performance in F4 and then most probably Formula Regional next up, and then Formula 3, whether he stays on with the FDA or not would probably be decided then. But the last, how long have I now been talking? 8 minutes has hopefully illustrated the problem to everybody, where we have a pool of incredibly talented drivers, but at the end of the day, just very, very limited seats. And I want to put this to you. Do you think it makes sense for the FDA to take on so many drivers and to support so many drivers with the end goal of eventually ending up in F1 if they really don't have the space for these many drivers? Now, from my perspective, I would argue that the big pro from the driver's side specifically is obviously Ferrari has a very well developed junior program. There's a lot of additional learning that actually takes place through a program such as this in terms of mental training, physical training, conditioning, overall race skills, racecraft, learning about the engineering side of racing, and all sorts of examples like that I think the FTA perhaps makes easier compared to if you weren't part of a driver academy. And I'm wondering whether a lot of the drivers actually reap that as the main benefit and don't particularly bank on the fact that they would eventually get into F1 on the back of the FTA, because as we've now seen, it's probably not going to happen. Now, I want to ask you, before I finish off, dear watcher or listener, depending on your platform, how many of these drivers do you think will eventually get to F1, and which drivers in the FTA do you think has the best chance of ending up in Formula One? Because as I now said, there are so many drivers across the different categories, different ages, and I'm very curious to hear from all of you what you think is probably going to happen with the FTA. And as we all know, I guess, the Ferrari Drivers Academy isn't the only academy with this problem. We saw quite recently Renault struggle with the same problem, whether to promote from the academy versus promoting a dinosaur in Fernando Alonso. And the Red Bull Driver Academy, or the driver program, they are well documented in the way that they handle their juniors. So it's an interesting model, a model that seems to work in the case of Charles Leclerc, that has graduated up into the Ferrari team. But how many drivers will fall by the wayside initially? So happy to hear your thoughts. Please let me know what you think. And as I asked at the beginning of the episode, if you enjoy listening to my silky smooth voice, please subscribe to this channel. I'm going to be back at the end of the Eiffel Grand Prix with a very exciting race recap with a very, very exciting guest. So please look out for that. And I can't wait to chat to you again. Bye, everybody.